Hi, this is Luis from Lambda School. In this video, we'll go through the basics of building web APIs using Node.js and the very popular Express framework. Along the way, we'll learn how to add Express to a Node.js application, how to use Express to create a web API, how to add endpoints that can respond to GET requests over HTTP, how to return JSON formatted data from our API, and how to make sure that we are returning the correct HTTP status codes to our clients. But first, let's go and take a look at some of the terminology that we'll be using throughout our session today. The first one is API, or Application Programming Interface. In this context, an API is server software that publishes a set of endpoints that clients can use to manage resources. So we mentioned endpoints and resources. But what is an endpoint? Well, technically, if you go look for it in the dictionary, it's going to tell you that it's one end of a communication channel. Yeah, that really helps. Well, what if I tell you is the touch points that make communication between two systems possible? Two systems refers to maybe a client like a web browser connecting to our API, right? But if we go down to our specific domain, which is web APIs, then we find that an endpoint is simply a URL or a uniform resource locator that points to the location of a resource available on the server. You may notice that we're again using the word resource. This is really important when we are designing APIs. So what are resources? You can think of resources as the things that our application cares about, the things that we want to manage, the nouns on the application domain. Let me give you some examples. If I tell you I'm building an API that is going to let you manage users, products, orders, clients, and returns, and then ask you, what do you think the application or the domain of my application is? You probably have a pretty good idea by now that this is about e-commerce. Okay, so the application domain refers to what is it that my application is trying to automate. Why are we building this application? What is it that we're trying to make more efficient by writing software for it? So now that we have a better idea of what an endpoint is, it's a simple URL that points to a particular resource, and we know that a resource can be something that our application can manage. Okay, let's go and take another look at our definition of an API. So it is server software, meaning that it's going to have clients and it's going to serve requests from those clients and send back responses, that publishes a set of endpoints, meaning that you can access them through a URL, and the clients of our API are going to be able to use those endpoints, those URLs, to manage resources, because each resource is uniquely accessible to a particular URL, as we'll see when we start writing code for it. I know what you're thinking. I know. This is what you're thinking. Show me the code. And I will. But before that, let's go back and take a look at where the code is and how to get the project that we're going to be working together throughout the week. In TrainingKit, in the sprint called Building RESTful Web Services with Express and Node.js, retake. If you go to TrainingKit and locate the sprint called Building RESTful Web Services with Express and Node.js, the first module is called Introduction to Node.js and Express. One of the objectives, specifically the last one on the list, is called Learn to create an API that can respond to GET requests. This is where you'll find instructions on how to download the starter code. It's on a GitHub repository, how to run it so you could test it in the browser. And also you'll find the code that we worked through as part of this video. It's got a few parts. The first one is an overview. And this is meant for you to see me build it, right? It's going to be a quick demo with a little bit of code, you don't have to follow along with this. Just read through it, because you're going to have a chance to go back, copy this code, follow these instructions, and then code along as we step by step build a new endpoint and add it to our server on the next part, which is the code along. So you will copy and paste this code by clicking on this button right here. I am going to type it, but you will copy it and then move to the second part after reading through this. The follow along. Okay, in this step, we will together, step by step, as you can see right here, we do one step and then the next one and then the next one, and you will pause the video and follow along with me as we build another endpoint that is going to be a little more real. The first one is just going to return hello world. We have to have a hello world, right? It's the first time we see how to build an API. We need a hello world example. Here we're going to return JSON, which is what most of the APIs out there return right now. JSON is the de facto data format to interchange between clients and APIs. So after we're done building this together, you will be faced with a challenge. And for this challenge, we're going to ask you to read some documentation. It's going to be on the README for the repository. I'll show you in a minute. And following the instructions on that README, you will build a new endpoint that is going to return data coming from a database that we have included for you on the project. So this is on your training kit. Go take a look at it and follow along and complete the challenge. If you have any questions completing the challenge, in the next class, you could talk to your PMs, your peers, and also to the instructor. There are also some extension links for you to go and look at the documentation and read a little more about Express. So let's go take a look at, we're almost coding. Let's go take a look at the project. It's called Node-Express Mini. Again, instructions are on the training kit, how to download and get this ready to go. In here, what's important is I'm going to show you the README, and then I'm going to show you on Visual Studio Code, my editor, the database access layer, the little file called db.js. What's important is you're going to run through this, specifically this first bullet point right here, because you will be using this find function. Remember that this returns a promise. And that means that you cannot return data to the client until this promise is either resolved or has failed. So follow the instructions on the challenge, and remember, keep in mind that you need to wait for the promise to resolve before returning any data to the clients. Okay, time for some code. Here we have the repository. I already cloned it to my computer. I haven't installed any of the npm packages yet. All I did was clone it into a folder. So let's take a quick look at what's included inside the data folder right here. You can ignore all of that for now. Only thing you care about is the README, but you'll probably read that on GitHub. And then inside data, there are some files that you will learn about next week as we talk about adding databases to our API. But the file that you care about today is this db.js file. You will use this function called find. If you see right here, this is the API for this particular data helper utility. And the first function that we are exporting there is called find, which simply returns a collection of users. Your job on the challenge is going to be to return this collection of users back to any clients doing a GET request to a particular endpoint. All right, enough of that. Let's go and build our API. So the first step, if we went back to the README and we look at the instructions, it's going to tell us, yeah, after you cloned it, you need to download all the packages. So we're going to say yarn or npm install if you're using npm. And this is going to create our node modules folder. It's going to bring in all of the packages that we have specified on package.json. No need for you to look in there just yet. All right. After doing that, the next step would be, hey, where is our API going to start execution? And for that, we're going to create a file called index.js. at the root of folder of the application, right next to the package.json file. This index.js is going to become our API. Normally, API code is going to be divided into different modules, different files, but for demo purposes, we're going to write all the code in this file for now. Okay? So, how do we start? Well, we said that we want to use Express to build our API. So the first thing is we need to somehow add Express to our application. Express is a simple npm module, so all we have to do is say yarn add or npm i or npm install Express. By doing this, you'll notice that inside of our package.json file, we'll have now a dependency called Express. A type of this recording for 16.3 is the latest version. You can ignore the rest. Why do we call our file index.js? Well, because we have this start script so that we can do npm start or yarn start that will use this little utility called nodemon to run our index.js file. What nodemon does is another npm package. What it does is that it watches for JavaScript files, and if we do any changes to it, it will restart the server automatically for us. You'll learn all about this when we start building applications from scratch. So don't stress over it now. Okay, so now that we have Express added to our application, we can start using it. Well, if we want to use anything in our application, we know that we need to import it. Somehow we need to bring it in and get a reference to it. In the case of Node.js, though, we do not use import. We use something called require that comes from the CommonJS module system. So the way that we bring an external module into our application using Node is by doing require. So it looks like this. I'm going to bring Express from the Express package. This is the syntax. I'm saving this as the constant Express, and I am requiring this Express package that is inside of my Node modules folder. Once we have a reference to that, the next step is, how do we create an Express application? How do we tell Express, hey, I want to have an app, I want to have a server, give me a server so that I can configure that server, add my endpoints, add my resources to it, and then have it listen for connections so that it can answer to requests coming into my server. So to create a server, we're going to say something like this: server equals Express. Calling this is going to give us an instance of a server powered by Express. And now we can proceed to configure that server. If we go back to the README, on the repository, you will see that we are giving you, well, not on the repository, sorry, on TrainingKit, you will see that the overview is going to explain to you line by line. We have comments in the code that's telling you what it does, but also we have an explanation underneath that's going to give you more information about what's going on each line. As we go through the video, though, I will do my best to also give you that explanations of what each line does. Okay? But remember, you're not required to code along with me. So listen to the explanations, jot down any questions you may have, and then follow with me as we build the next endpoint. So after we have the Express application ready, all we have to do now is say, hey, I want you to listen to requests coming on a particular port on my computer and answer to those requests. And the way that we do this is saying, hey, server, I want you to listen to connections. Remember, this is a communication thing. Our clients are going to communicate with our servers. So we need to tell it which port on our computer, a number, right? I'm going to give it port 8000. And a port in our computer is, if you think of our computer as a building that has many, many apartments, a port would be like one of those doors to get into one of those apartments. Normally, our computers have a whole bunch of services running. In the case of servers like web servers, they have some of those services are internal, but some of those services are for the public. They are made available so that other people can connect to that server and do things there. Now, a server can have more than one service running. And normally what happens, let's say that you have a server that has email, but also has a website running. The email server will be running, or the service is going to be running on a particular port, a standard port reserved for that. In the case of email servers, I think it's port 25. But web servers by default are going to be running on port 80. This is the public facing, the outward facing websites, web servers, sorry. Our application, it's like a web server. Only that since it's going to be used internal, we're not going to use the reserved ports for outside communication. So we cannot use 80. We will be using, there's a range. If you go on and search for, available ports on computers, you will see that there is a particular range of ports. I think start at port 3000 to a particular number that you can use. We will be using port 8000. It's just an arbitrary port that we chose. A lot of the examples you see for Node.js are going to be using port 3000, but then a React application that we add, when we use create React app to start up an application, it will run by default also in port 3000, which is kind of unfortunate. So we are going to use port 8000. The second argument on this could be a callback function that we could use to do things like maybe do a console log to make sure that the system is running correctly. So API running on port 8000. And that's it. That would be our server. Only that our server doesn't know about any endpoints yet. This technically is a server, and it will run, and you can run it, and it will listen for connections. Only that it's got no endpoints configured. So before we run it, let's go and configure the first endpoint. This endpoint is going to be, of course, the quintessential hello world. We will return hello world as a string to the browser or to the client on any request that comes into the root of our web API. All right, so let's add this route. So server dot, and now as we build an application with Express, Express is going to provide a nice and clean API that we can use to configure our server. Part of that is a set of methods that correspond to HTTP methods or HTTP verbs. HTTP, we talked about this in the lesson about AJAX and HTTP. HTTP is the communication protocol, a set of rules that we use to communicate between client and server. This is what powers the internet. The internet runs on HTTP, and all of the data that is transmitted across the wire is basically strings of text, and then each side of the communication knows what to do with those strings and how to produce strings to send back the responses. So when we are creating our server, we're going to say, hey, I want you to pay attention to any GET request, so any request over HTTP using the GET method. And if it's a GET to this particular URL, and this means the route of our site, the root of our web application. So if our server is running on api.example.com, if you go to api.example.com /, the browser will remove the slash, but / means this is the root of our site. Now, when a GET request comes to the root of our site, I want you to execute this function right here. And this is a callback function that is going to get executed only if the verb of the request is GET and the URL is / or the root of our site. And this could be a regular function or it could be an arrow function. There's no special requirements for this to be an arrow function. Okay, so on every function, this function has a name. This is called a request handler function. And Express is going to provide this function with these arguments. The first one is the request object, and the second one is another object that represents the response. And we can use those objects and the methods in it to do things like, for instance, in this case, I want to send a string back. So the response object has this send method that we can use to send our hello world back to the client. These methods, some of the methods that you will see on the request and the response are provided by Node.js, and some of them are provided by Express.js or augmented with new functionality by Express.js to make them easier and simpler to use. Believe it or not, we're done. This is all we need to do. So the basic steps are: we bring in Express, we create an Express application, we wire any endpoints that we want to listen to, we produce a response and send it back to the client within the route handler function of those endpoints, and then we tell our server to listen for connections on a particular port. So how do we test this? Well, let's run it. Luckily, our project is already configured with a script, so all we have to do is say yarn start or npm start, and that will run our server. And we see that message here, API running on port 8000. And since this is running on our computer, we could go and try it by opening a web page and go to localhost port, and the port is separated by a column. So localhost is my computer, and then the port is going to be 8000, and the address is slash, but you will notice that the browser removes the slash. And here we go. We have the expected response, which is hello world. Nice. Now, this is a string, right? It's pretty simple to produce. If we go look at the source though, the browser is smart enough to take our simple string that we send, and it wraps it. Let me make this a little bigger so that it's easier to read. It automatically wraps that inside a basic HTML skeleton. So you see there's no title, there's nothing, because all we're doing is just sending this string. So the browser is smart enough to do that for us. But all we really sent over the network is just the string. That's all we got. Now, status codes, we're going to come back and take a look at those because we mentioned those a couple of times before. But for now, let's go back and take one more look at our code. So, in order to have a fully functional Express web API or web application, because this is a server that we can use for web applications, for web APIs, we can use it for real-time communication. If we wanted to have some kind of chat application that is real time, or a product, something that a game that is real time, we could use Express for that too, or use Node.js in general, because there are other libraries that we can use for that stuff. But for API on web application, Express is excellent, right? So all we have to do is bring it in, generate a brand new instance of Express. This is going to give us our server, configure that server, adding things like endpoints. This is one of the things that we can add. We'll learn about other things that we can configure in our server as we go along on the week. And then just have the server listen for connection on a particular port on our computer. By using the utility that I showed you called NodeMon, every time we make a change, let's say that we add this exclamation here, save it, and you will see that the server will restart automatically, and this is NodeMon doing that for us. So if we go back now to the browser and refresh the page, you'll see the exclamation point has been added. That's it. You know how to build an API that the response to GET request with a simple string. Next, we're going to have you follow along with me. So remember to pause the video when necessary, as we make this a little more real by returning JSON instead of a simple string. So the next step is to create a brand new endpoint that is going to return a list of hobbits. So as you're doing this, you're going to go back to the overview, follow the instructions, make sure that you have your API running at this state, and then follow along with me as we add the rest of the code. So the first thing is we need to do is what? Well, we need to define our endpoint. Our server is already running. We just want to be able to go and visit something called slash, like a URL that ends in /hobbits, and we want the server to send back a JSON collection of hobbits. So let's go wire up that endpoint. I'll say server.get, and the URL that I care about now is called hobbits. And of course, we're gonna have, just so you know, these are called the homies here in Lambda School, because they always go together. So we have the homies, rec and res, and then in here, now we're gonna do things a little differently, because we said that we want to return some JSON that is gonna be a list of hobbits. So we need that list. So the first thing we do is we're gonna create a list of hobbits. This is going to be a pure array. It's gonna be in memory, and each hobbit should have an ID that is unique, and then maybe a name. So the first one is, of course, the more important character in the Lord of the Rings, Samwise Gamgee. Next would be, of course, Frodo Baggins. I think that's enough. So we have our hobbits. It's a JavaScript array. All we have to do now is take this, parse it, turn it into a string, respecting the JSON format, right? Remember that each property must be in double quotes. If it's a number, it doesn't have quotes, but if it's something other than a number, then or a Boolean, it will have double quotes. And of course, there are other rules that you need to apply to make this a JSON response. Luckily, we don't have to do any of that. Express already does that for us. So another thing that we want to do is we want to talk about HTTP methods for a minute. So what are those? HTTP, not methods, but status codes. So the HTTP response status codes indicate whether a specific HTTP request has been successfully completed. This is what Mozilla Developer Network Web Docs says. Essentially, when a client is using our API, we have this secret code that we share when building the API between the client and the this is a standard set of codes that we can use to let the client know the result of whatever operation they're trying to do is. So if they are trying to access a resource, we could send a correct HTTP status code to let the client know, hey, you could not access this because the resource does not exist, maybe because you have no access to it, maybe because you need to be authenticated first, or maybe simply, yes, I got it, here it is, and just send you the response. Those codes are organized, and as it says right here, they are defined in this particular document. You can read it if you want to. This link is inside of your training kit article, so you can go and come and read a lot more about it. But essentially, you have a set of codes, and they are grouped by numbers. So the first one, we rarely use those. Those are information responses. We start using them right here. So anything between 200 and 299 means it was successful. Anything between 300 and 399 would be redirection. So this is when something moves. Anything between 400 and 499 is saying, hey, the client made a mistake. So I'm going to tell you this is a bad request. And you have seen this, 404 not found. So if a client is trying to access a resource that doesn't exist on the server, it's a problem on the client. We're telling you, hey, you've given me an address to a resource that I no longer have. And anything between 500 and 599 is an error on the server. This is the server or the API. We telling the client, hey, either 500, you probably have seen that too. It's, hey, I don't know what happened, I just had an error, okay? Or maybe this is not implemented. Maybe this service unavailable is basically saying, hey, I'm overwhelmed, I have too much work to do and I can't respond to you right now. Maybe you could try it later and I'm gonna be okay. Okay, so take a quick look at those, okay? Because part of designing good and friendly web APIs is returning always the correct HTTP response status code. Of course, we're gonna do that, okay? So how do we do that? Well, you have to set some headers, and there's a whole bunch of technology behind that. Locally, again, if you go and say, hey, response object, I would like to set this status code to be 200, and 200 means okay, means everything was successful. And then we could do something like send, right? Send, and send the hobbits. And this will totally work. But I want to communicate to the next developer working on this API that this is not just sending some data. I'm not sending this JavaScript away. I want to let them know I am sending JSON. But also, there is an intricate communication between the client and the server where the client can say, hey, my preferred data format is going to be JSON, or it's going to be something called XML, which is another way of sending data over the wire, over the internet, over the network, right? But in my server, I could say, hey, unless the client is overriding this somehow, it's telling me that it doesn't want JSON, I am sending JSON back. And there is a JSON method. Normally, I default to using that whenever I'm building a JSON API. If not, because this is going to force this to be JSON, but because this communicates clearly to the next developer working on my code that this is a JSON API and this is intending to return JSON. And of course, if the client is not making a preference, then I will return JSON by default from my API. And that's it. Let's go try this out on the browser. Let's save. Let me make sure that we save this. Okay. It should have restarted automatically, and it did. No errors. So let's go back to the browser and see what happens when we visit. We could see if refreshing this, we still have our main endpoint by going to /hobbits. Now we have our data back. And yeah, it looks like a regular JavaScript API. And by the way, I'm using a Chrome extension that formats it nicely. Yours may look a little different if you don't have that extension. There's a link on TrainingKit to the extension. It's called JSON View. And this is what's making it look pretty nice like this. But if you go into the network tab, we all have done this. So let's go take a look at the network tab here. Look at the XHR. Well, look at just all of the requests. You will see somewhere buried, somewhere in here, that we are hitting the Hobbits endpoint. If we click on this to see the details, you will see that it was a GET request with a 200 OK. This is the code that we sent. Okay, and then in the response down here, where's the response headers? Oh, here it is. In the response, we could see the preview and the response. So this is what we got back, this string with well-formatted JSON done automatically for us. Of course, the browser is going to let me preview that as just the array so that we can expand it and see the data in there. But the real response coming from the server is this JSON formatted string. Pretty nice, pretty fast, with very little work on our part to get that done. Okay, hopefully you pause the video as we build this step by step, and you have a better idea of the flow of building APIs and web applications in general using Express. Okay, we learned quite a few things along the way, and now it's time for you to go and read the challenge and use, remember, we provided for you this data file. You know that instead of using imports like this is equivalent to using import express from express, as you have seen it before. This is equivalent to that. So you will gonna use this same technique to get access to this data db.js so that you can use that and call methods like find on it for the challenge. Hint. Okay. All right. So let's go back and take a look at what we have learned. What have we learned? Well, we learned that we can use Express to create web APIs, and we saw how we can create an Express application, how we can bring Express into our into a Node.js file and just turn that into an Express application. We saw what are endpoints and how to create them, how to respond to GET requests. We will see how to respond to other HTTP methods in future lessons, how to return JSON data, how little work we have to do that, and how to return correct HTTP status codes and why this is important. All that's left to do is thank you for being here with us, and my contact information, I'm Luis Hernandez. I'm on Slack at Luis, and my email, luis@lambdaschool.com. Thank you very much. Have a great day.